There are 5 objects on which you can grant permissions to a user or role within the SSIS catalog, and those are listed in this table. So there's the catalog itself. You can only have one catalog in any instance of SQL Server, and it contains all the projects and packages that you've deployed. SSIS admin. Membership in the SSIS admin role is required to do things with that object, set properties, configure it, and so forth. Then there's a folder. Any permissions that you assign to a folder are inherited by the objects that it contains, although you can override permissions for contained objects. So there's a hierarchy of permissions. Next object is a project, and permissions that you assign to a project apply to the project itself as well as any object it contains. There's an environment. Permissions that you assign here apply to the environment themselves as well as the variables contained within it. And then the operation object, permissions that you assign here will apply to all instances of all operations, including executions. And operations, of course, are just things you can do. So you can secure operations within the SSIS catalog. So one thing to notice about this is that a package is not in the list. You control permissions on packages through its containment object, and usually that's going to be a folder. All right, then the list of permissions is a bit more extensive. So you have the create object permission, and this is the ability to create objects in a folder, and it applies to folders. Execute controls the ability to run the packages in a project. That applies to a project. Execute objects grants the ability to run all packages in all projects in a folder, and that applies at the folder level and then cascades down to all of the objects in that folder. Manage object permissions controls the ability to change permissions on all objects in a folder, and again applies to a folder. Manage permissions controls the ability to change the permissions of an object, doing things like granting or denying permissions. And that applies to folder, project, environment, and operations. Modify, the ability to change an object, including properties, and that applies to folder, project, environment, and operation. You can modify objects, and that controls the ability to make changes to objects in a folder. That applies to a folder. Read is the ability to read metadata, including properties, and that applies to folder, project, environment, and operation. And read objects, which is the ability to read every object in a folder, and that applies to a folder. Okay, so pretty straightforward. If you're used to the granular permissions that were introduced in the database engine with SQL Server 2005, you're going to be pretty comfortable with how these permissions work and apply to securable objects. All right, so let's take a look at managing security in the SSIS catalog with Management Studio. Because this is one of the big changes that came with the introduction of the SSIS catalog in SQL Server 2012. And that's that you manage integration services in Management Studio by logging into the database engine, instead of logging into the instance of integration services. So this goes a long way in simplifying the life of integration services administrators. Now I'm going to explore the user interface for managing permissions on the objects in the SSIS catalog. So I'll start Management Studio. No need to run it as administrator. And I'll log in to the database engine on the local instance of SQL Server 2014 in this case. And I'll use Windows Authentication because I'm an admin in this instance of SQL Server. Click on Connect. And I'll go down here to the Integration Services Catalog and drill down into the Learn Now folder. So I'll right-click on that folder and select Properties. And that opens up the Folder Properties dialog box, and I manage the permissions in the Permissions page here. So what this page does is it lets you select principals that you want to assign permissions to and the permissions that they should receive. And as you can see, there aren't any assignments yet because I've not configured security beyond the defaults. And basically, the default is that only sysadmins within this instance of the database engine are able to access this folder. All right, so I'm going to click on the Browse button for logins and roles. And this opens the Browse All Principals list. Unlike other parts of Management Studio that make you enter at least a part of a principal's name, then search for the one you want, this dialog box provides a list of all principals that are able to have integration services permissions assigned to them. So in this case, I'm going to select DBO and SSIS admin. Okay, again, a little bit of a contrived situation, but I'm going to go with this. And I'll click on OK, and that adds both of those to that list of logins and roles. Make this a little bit bigger. I don't think I can. No, I can't. Yep, I can't change the size between those two areas, unfortunately. All right, now I'm going to assign permissions to the DBO user. Now, notice that by default, this user has no permissions assigned to it. But this grid down here shows all of the available permissions. And these are permissions on a folder because that's what I originally right-clicked and opened up the Properties dialog box for, so folders. So if I right-click on other kinds of objects, the list of permissions here is going to be different. And as you can see, I can either grant or deny a particular permission to this user. Now I'll select the SS admin user. Notice that this user, because it's an admin role, has all permissions automatically assigned to it, and I can't deselect them. So as a system admin role, members of the SSIS admin role also have full control over integration services irrevocably. So be careful who you assigned to that role, as with any admin role. In fact, any role at all.